Well, the title of the seminar that I'm doing today is Charging Faërie, Cartography as the Threshold of Enchantment. And we're going to start by Tolkien. In 1931, Tolkien wrote Mythopoeia as a direct response to C.S. Lewis, who had called myths lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. Tolkien disagreed. In the poem, he wrote, "Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. His world dominion by creative act, it not his to worship the great artifact. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splinter from a single white, the many hues and endlessly combined, living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled, with elves and goblins that we dared to build. Gods on their houses, out of dragon lights, and so with the seeds of dragons 'twas our right. Used or misused, the right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made." When a human being makes a story, they are doing something far more serious than inventing. They are sub-creating, exercising a capacity that is, in his view, part of what it means to be human. I'm an architect, a doctoral researcher, and I came to Tolkien the way architects tend to come to things, through space and image. To the question of how imaginary places are built and what makes them feel not real, but at least coherent. I want to start with an idea that Franco Farinelli, one of the great critics of cartography, develops in his 1989 essay, Certezza dal rappresentare. Do we inhabit the Earth, or do we inhabit the map of the Earth? Farinelli argues that the map does not represent the territory, it produces it, that it is not the map that is a copy of the world, but the world that becomes a copy of the map. What happens then when a territory never existed in the first place? And I would argue that Tolkien understood this intuitively long before Farinelli wrote a word, because Tolkien did not draw maps after he finished writing, as probably we all know. He drew maps while he was writing, sometimes even before. In an interview with the BBC, he said it plainly. I had maps, of course. If you're going to have a complicated story, you must work to a map. Otherwise, you can never make a map of it with words. The territory and the narrative are not separate things to him. They produce each other. That is the central argument I want to build today, but to get there, we need to start at the beginning, at least for me, with architecture. Architecture in fantasy is everywhere. Every fantasy world has buildings, cities, and landscapes. But nobody seems to ask what they actually mean, or whether they mean anything at all beyond a backdrop or decoration. That was the starting point. Not Tolkien as a writer, but Tolkien as someone who had constructed with extraordinary precision a world that was later translated into a visual universe. And the question was simple. Is there a code? Does the architecture of Middle-earth operate as a language itself? To answer that, I went back to the primary sources, the novels, as well as to the illustrations Alan Lee did for the special centenary edition of The Lord of the Rings that would eventually define the look of Peter Jackson's movies. Lee worked closely with Tolkien's estate, and his drawings are arguably the most authoritative visual translation of the writing descriptions apart from the ones of Tolkien himself. But I also worked with the Peter Jackson films, and I want to be transparent about why. The films are the form in which a lot of people first encountered these spaces. They are the point at which the written code became a shared visual language for most people. Understanding how the architecture was transmitted in the translation is, in my opinion, as important as understanding how it was originally conceived. The tool I use to map the relationships between all these elements is a graph. It will appear through the lecture. A diagram in which each point or node represents an element and the lines between them indicates a relationship. The larger the node, the greater the number of connections it has. These first graphs you will see today have black nodes for main categories, warm tones referring to places, elements, and buildings from the Lord of the Middle-earth, actually. The cool tones refer to elements from the real world. What the graph makes visible is precisely the code that we were saying before, the network of relationships between real architectural traditions and imaginary civilizations of the Middle-earth, mediated by the said relationship with the natural world. From that analysis, four rules emerged in the architecture of the Middle Earth. The first rule is the relationship between races and history of their kingdoms. Gondor is the most complex case. Tolkien associated it with the Byzantine Empire, a civilization that had been great and was now in decline, living on the memory of its own past. And the architecture reflects that precisely. The stone construction implies technological advancement, but the finest craftsmanship belongs to the oldest buildings. Newer constructions are cruder, and the city is literally built on its own history. Parallel Tolkien constructs with Mont Saint Michel is telling. Both are fortresses saved by conflict. Both are built on rocky outcrops that recall a maritime past, and both are crowded by a singular building. The abbey in one case, the citadel in the other. Even the bastion of Minas Tirith is described in the novels as having a prow sharp as the keel of a ship, pointing east, a direct reference to the Númenórean seafaring origins of the Dunedain. This is one of the graphs that state, I'm sorry because they are in Spanish, part of my thesis that is written in Spanish as well, but they kind of state the different relationships between Gondor, that is the city that we're talking about, and different architectural elements, as well as different architects or other cities in the Middle Earth that are related in some form of way. The Great Gate of Minas Tirith makes the same argument in miniature, originally iron, rebuilt by dwarfs in Mithril. Two materials, two races, two moments in the city history, visibly simultaneously in a single architectural element. The building is a record of everything that has happened to the people who made it. The second rule, is a relationship between each of the Tolkien races with nature. Tolkien was famously a critic of industrialization. He saw the Industrial Revolution as a rupture between human beings and the natural world, and he encoded this vision into the architecture of Middle Earth. The elves are the clearest example of this. Immortal, passionate about the arts, and deeply connected to the natural world, they build in three distinct ways depending on the level of tectonic constructions in their kingdom. In Lothlorien, the most nature-bound of the elven realms, they build not by imitating nature, but with it. The city sits in the canopy of malon trees. The trees are the floor, the ceiling, and the structure. And we can as well, in the films, sense a sense of magic appearing by a color change between the lower part of the forest and Lothlorien while they ascend. In Rivendell, which is more urbanized and more fortified, found by Elrond after a war, they can no longer build directly with nature because they do not have the time, so they imitate it instead. The Art Nouveau elements through Rivendell used in the films, the organic forms in metal and stone, the tracery that mimics branches, all of it is the architectural language of a civilization whose relationship with nature has become representational rather than direct. Hobbits, by contrast, literally inhabit the earth. Their smiles, the hobbit holes, are excavated into hillsides with rounded openings and curved walls, a vernacular architecture that recalls the arts and crafts movement, handmade, locally rooted, and anti-industrial. The third rule is the relationship between the races. When two races have coexisted, collaborated, or come into contact, the architecture shows it. In Rivendell, alongside the Art Nouveau that can be seen in the film's Elvish forms, there are Romanesque arcs, because men have lived and walked it too. And in the films, these are represented by Romanesque, usually. In the caves of Thandriel, the elves had to ask the dwarves for help when Mirkwood became uninhabitable, and the result is a fusion, Art Nouveau forms combined with the more geometric Art Deco quality of dwarvish construction. The columns imitate roots, but robustly in stone with a precision that belongs to a different sensibility entirely. The architecture is, in this sense, a record of alliances. And the fourth one is the relationship between evil and everything else. The architecture of evil in Middle-earth has no identity of its own. It never creates. It appropriates or pervades. Minas Morgul was Minas Ithil before the Nazgûl took it. Isengard was a place of knowledge before Saruman corrupted it. The Tower of Orthanc superimposes Elvish pointed arches on to manage rounded ones, increases everything in scale, strips every element of its original intention, and leaves only form without meaning. And crucially, everywhere that evil takes hold, nature is destroyed. The landscape around Isengard is striped bare to fit the forges. That is the logical conclusion of the spectrum we began with. The farther a civilization moves from nature, the closer it moves to evil. But this raises a larger question. If the architecture of Middle-earth operates as a coherent system, if it can't be decoded, then is this code unique to Tolkien fantasy, to Middle-earth, or does it belong to something broader? Is there a shared architectural language of modern fantasy? That is the question the next phase of the research set out to answer. To answer that question, the corpus had to expand. If Tolkien's architectural code was going to be tested against something, it needed to be tested against a universe different enough to be meaningful, but similar enough to make comparison possible. Harry Potter presented itself as a counterpart. Both universes were conceived as literature before becoming film. Both belong to the British cultural imagination. Both have architecture that is immediately recognizable, and both were produced after the late 19th century, the moment when fantasy as a genre divides into different traditions. Ones that introduced supernatural as inherent to the world it creates, and one that returned to mythological structure. Rowling belongs to the first one, Tolkien belongs to the second one. Mythology was straightforward in principle and exhaustive in practice. Every film in both franchises was watched in full multiple times, and the result was a database of 786 video clips, each one of maximum 1 minute, of all the moments in the films that architecture appeared. Cataloged, code, and cross-reference with the corresponding passages in the novel. The starting point was Juan Antonio Ramírez. He's a scholar, Spanish, he died, who in his book Edificios y Sueños, Buildings and Dreams, identifies 5 characters of architecture: form, materials, spatial aspect, synesthetic aspects, and semantic charge. Those 5 categories are necessary but not sufficient for fantastical architecture. So after first analysis, 12 categories that are the ones that we used in this research are structure, material, style, magic, materialization, evil, scale, movement, replication, spatial dissonance, function, and security. Structure is altered when an element could not support itself in the real world. The bridge over the falls in Rivendell would collapse under its own weight, mostly the hammer beam roof of the Great Hall in Hogwarts that are suspended without any relation to the building structure. In both cases, the structure is fantastical, not because it looks impossible, but because in the real world it would be impossible. Style is altered when the stylistic references of an element have been deliberately combined, exaggerated, or displaced from the original context of an architecture was already so. Art Nouveau combined with Gothic, Hogwarts combines Gothic and Tudor in a way that no real building would. The result is read as ancient and authoritative precisely because it creates its own language. Magic as a parameter appears when the architecture itself changes. The Great Hall ceiling is the clearest example. It reflects the weather outside. It transforms Christmas into silver and ice. But also the stairs move themselves in the films of Harry Potter. And there was actually a difference. Evil operates different in the 2 universes, and this is one of the most significant findings. In Middle-earth, Evil transforms morphology. It takes existing architecture and perverts it physically, increases scale, strips ornament, inverts meaning. The building changes, shape under Evil's influence. In the Harry Potter universe, Evil is just an atmospheric condition. The Ministry of Magic, under Voldemort's control, does not change its structure, it changes its iconography. The fountain of magical breath and it's replaced by a sculpture showing magos being crushed under the weight of withholding power. Same space, same architecture, but different ideologies made visible through decoration rather than form. The topological relationships between parameters and places were mapped through a graph, a diagram in which nodes represent either locations or parameters, and the edges between them represent relationship. In here, I know it's difficult to read in the screen because it's a little bit crowded of words, but these are all the little gray dots are all the scenes in which the films have architecture in either of both universes. The dots that are orange are architectural buildings or cities in the Harry Potter universe. The ones that are in green are from the Middle Earth, and the purple ones are the one that kind of connect. So it's the characteristics that were changed in order for the architecture not to be real in each elements, as well as in Spanish. So I guess. And that graph that you have seen, mainly it's a little bit complicated to explain here in such short time, but answers the original question. There is a SER code, the parameter that appears in both universe, structure, style, scale, replication, safety, form a common architectural language of modern fantasy, but the parameters that diverge, particularly evil and magic, reveal that each universe has its own specific logic, its own relationship between architecture and narrative that cannot be fully reproduced to the SER code. Fantastical architecture is not arbitrary. It operates as a sign, as in Umberto Eco's sense said, between emitter and receiver, there must be a common code. So the code exists, it can be described, and it is in part shared across universes that have no direct relationship with each other in order for us to be undisturbed. But here's what finding opens up rather than closes down. If the architecture produces the narrative, if the built world is not only a backdrop, then the question is not only how fantasy is constructed spatially, the question is how fantasy is generated at all. What produces the condition in which a secondary world becomes coherent enough to be believed? For that, we need to go back to Tolkien and to an essay he delivered at St. Andrews in 1938. In 1938, Tolkien delivered a lecture at St. Andrews that he later revised and published as on fairy stories. It is one of the most important documents in theory of fantasy literature, and I believe it's not usually read as a spatial argument. I want to read it that way today. Tolkien begins with a question that sounds fictional, but it's actually ontological. What is a fairy story? His answer is not what most people expect. Fairy story, he says, is not a story about fairies. It is a story about Faërie, the realm itself. And Faërie, he is careful to insist, cannot be defined. It can only be approached. That is a spatial claim disguised as a literary one. The realm of fairy is not a concept. It is a place. And its defining characteristic is that it resists full description and that it always exceeds whatever representation is made of it. This is where Tolkien introduces the concept that will become central to everything that follows, subcreation. When a writer constructs a secondary world with sufficient internal coherence, something happens to the reader that Tolkien distinguishes very carefully from what Coleridge called the willing suspension of disbelief. Tolkien rejects that. What really happens is the story maker probes a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment this belief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. Now think back to the architectural code we have just described. The 4 rules of Middle-earth, nature, history, race, and evil are precisely laws that help that secondary world be visible in stone and wood and metal. The code is the mechanism through which secondary belief is most easily produced. Every time a reader or a viewer encounters an Elvis arc or a Hobbit door or the layer rings of Minas Tirith, they are receiving information that confirms the internal consistency of the world. The architecture is doing also the work of subcreation. But Tolkien goes farther. He identifies 4 functions of fairy stories: fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. The most important for our purpose is recovery, which he defines not as nostalgia, but as something more radical. Recovery is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are, but seeing things as we are, or we were, meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. Recovery, in Tolkien's sense, it would happen when the secondary world makes the primary world visible again, when the fantastic defamiliarizes the familiar, when you see horses more clearly because you have spent time with dragons. So Why should a man be scorned if, he said, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home, or if when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics in jails and prison walls? The secondary world, as he says, is not a retreat from reality. It is a lens through which reality becomes newly perceptible. An architecture, because it is the most material, most inhabitable for the arts, is the most powerful instrument of that lens. You do not just read about Rivendell, you enter it, you move through it, you orient yourself within it. This brings us to the most precise concept in the essay, and the one that the title of this lecture takes its name from. Tolkien described what happens at the boundary between the primary world and the secondary world, the moment of crossing over, as the threshold of enchantment. It is not a dramatic rupture, it's a gradual, almost imperceptible transition, and it depends on one essential condition. The secondary world must never be complete. The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high, and is filled with many things. Its very richest strangeness make dumb the traveler who would report it. A world that can be fully described, fully mapped, fully known, ceases to be enchanting. The threshold only exists because there is always something beyond it that cannot be reached. The map must always leave something unmapped. And that is precisely where cartography enters. Because if subcreation depends on internal consistency, and if the threshold of enchantment depends on irreducible incompleteness, then the question of how fantastical a territory is mapped is a central one. The map must be coherent enough to produce secondary relief and incomplete enough to preserve enchantment. It must be simultaneously a system and a horizon. How does Tolkien cartography achieve that? And actually, can any cartography of a real or imaginary territory actually represent a place? In 1502, a Portuguese cartographer produced what we now call the Cantino Planisphere, one of the earliest maps to show the coastlines of the Americas. It was drawn before any European had fully explored those territories. The landmass was there, named, bounded, given coordinates before it existed for European purposes as a known place. The map does not wait for a territory to be fully known. It produces a territory in the act of representing it. It decides what exists and what doesn't, what has a name and what remains unnamed, what falls inside the frame of what is left outside. And those decisions are never neutral. They encode power, ideology, and perspective. They are, in Farnelly's terms, exercises of the cartographic reason that modernity inherited from the map. The idea that to know a place is to be able to draw it, and that what cannot be drawn does not fully exist. Borges understood the logical stream of this and pushed it there in one paragraph. In one of his tales on exactitude in science, he describes an empire whose cartographers, unsatisfied with reduction, produced a map so detailed and so precise that it ends up being the exact size of the empire itself. 1-to-1. The map covers the territory perfectly, and, well, it becomes useless, because a map that reproduces the territory at a 1-1 scale is not a map. It has ceased to represent and simply has become. Borges is pointing at the same possibility as Farinelli, but from the opposite direction. Farinelli says the world becomes a copy of the map. Borges said that a map that fully reproduces the world destroys itself as a map. Both are pointing at the same structural condition, that representation and territory cannot coincide. Every map is an act of selection, and every act of selection is an act of construction. The most vivid demonstration of this, one most of us grew up without noticing. The Mercator projection, which has been the dominant world map in Western education for centuries, represents the continent at dramatically distorted relative sizes, magnifying the northern hemisphere and diminishing the south. Europe appears larger than South America. Greenland appears larger than Africa. Neither is true. The Gall-Peters projection corrects these proportions, and in doing so, makes visible how profoundly Mercator's choices encoded a particular vision of the world, one in which the colonial powers of the North occupied more space, literally, than the territories they colonized. In response to this, in 1943, the Uruguayan artist Joaquín Torres García made this argument even more explicitly. He drew a map of South America with the South at the top. Every coastline is correct, every geographical feature is accurate, but the continent faces upward, for what is usually represented, and in doing so, it produces a completely different spatial imagination of the continent's relationship to itself, to its neighbors, to the rest of the world. He called it Nuestro norte es el sur, our north is the south, as they usually orient to the south. The early surviving attempt at creating a world map, attributed to Anaximandro, is the 6th century before Christ, placed Greece at the center of a circular world surrounded by an ocean. The geometry was philosophical before it was geographical. The map argued for a particular understanding of the cosmos, one in which the known world, the Greek world, occupied the axis around which everything else was organized. The medieval TO maps went further. They placed Jerusalem at the center. The three continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, were arranged around it in a configuration that reproduced the letter T within the circle of the ocean. These were theological arguments, basically. The world organized according to scripture, with the sacred city at its heart. Every element of the representation carried symbolic weight that exceeded geography. And the tension between the creation and the representation, it's something that fantasy has always understood, because maps for fantastic literature are always arguments. The history of imaginary cartography is a history of maps that have made their constructiveness visible, and they abandon the pretense of objectivity and use the map as what it always was, a tool for producing worlds. Jonathan Swift, Nudies, and the maps, including Gulliver's Travels, are drawn in the precise style of 18th century navigation charts, with compass roses and scales, bars, and soundings. The satire works precisely because the map looks exactly like a real map. It borrows the epistemological authority of cartography and points it at a fiction, making visible in doing so how much of that authority in real maps is also a performance. Each separate map of the 100-acre wood operates differently but makes a related argument. It is a child's map, sketchy, hand-drawn, full of character. It shows a spruce house and piglet house, and a place where the woozle wasn't, an absence, not something that was there. The territory it represents is entirely structured by the relationships between its inhabitants and their emotional experience of the landscape. It is, in Farnelli's terms, a geography of places rather than a geography of surfaces. The map notes that what matters about the 100-acre wood, it's not its coordinates, but what it means to those who live in it. Another map that is greatly known is the map of Narnia, produced for C.S. Lewis Chronicles. It is a world that exists in a wardrobe, a territory that is spatially impossible in relation to our own, accessible only through a threshold. The map gives it coherence because it gives it coastlines, mountain range, the castle of Kerparabel. It argues visually that Narnia is a real place with real geography, and in doing so, it produces exactly what it represents. Before you read the book, the map tells you that this world actually exists. All of these maps there is a quality that distinguishes them from real cartography, even as they borrow its visual language. They are openly, knowingly constructed. They make no claim to neutral representation, and in that openness, they reveal something that real cartography conceals, that all maps are constructions, that every representation of a territory is also a projection of it, and that the authority of the map has always rested not on objectivity, but on the convincingness of its argument. Which brings us to the most sophisticated fantastical cartography in the history of the genre, at least from my point of view, and to a map that is not an illustration, not a navigation tool, not a supplement to a narrative, but a generative fact. A world called into being through the act of being drawn. Tolkien drew maps the way other writers take notes, continuously, obsessively, and always in parallel with the narrative rather than after it. The maps were not produced to illustrate a finished world. They were the instrument through which the world was built. One of the first drawings, maybe, it's not exactly a map of Middle-earth at all. It's a watercolor Tolkien made in 1915, The Source of Faërie, a coastal landscape with trees, one silver and one gold, flaking an inklet that opens onto a luminous sea. It is not cartographic in a technical sense. There is no scale, no orientation, no toponymy, but it establishes something fundamental that for Tolkien, the fantastic territory begins with a horizon, with the line between the known and the unknown, with a shore. The working nature of Tolkien's cartographic practice is made visible in a document that is easy to overlook, a sketch of the fortification of Helm's Deep, drawn on the back of a student's essay from Oxford around 1942. Tolkien was planning the battle while grading papers. The map is rough, schematic, covered in annotations, distances, troops. The territory of the battle had to be spatially coherent before the narrative could unfold in it. And the architecture of the event depended on the geography being worked out first. Thor's map, on the other hand, the map of the Lonely Mountain. It's the first fully realized example of Tolkien's cartographic language. It is drawn in the style of a medieval document, decorative typography, a compass rose oriented to the earth, to the east, runes along the margins, a small illustration of the dragon smoke curled over the Lonely Mountain. It wants to look ancient. It looks found rather than made. Tolkien understood that a map's authority comes not only from its accuracy, but from its legibility as a cultural object, from the language it borrows and the historical depth that language implies. Thor's map looks like something that has survived centuries because that is what it needs to be, narratively. The map is already performing the world before you open the book. And the map of Middle-earth in the Third Age. The great map produced by Tolkien in collaboration with his son Christopher is a different order of object entirely. It is one of the most complete spatial records of the world Tolkien built, and it rewards analysis as a layered document rather than a single image. Here, it's also one of the documents that is annotated by him and Paul and Bynes while they were drawing and deciding on if things were correct or the distances, And if you kind of decompose it, you can see several and different ways of constructing the territory, not just by only the map, but all the different layers that he uses that can be overlooked at first. First, the layer that it's not itself a layer of the map, because it's how he was thinking and his annotations and his conversation with Paul and Bynes. But as well, we can see some of the drawings that he's doing. He's kind of measuring the distances, so then the narrative has sense in itself and the travel makes sense. Here also we can see that he uses a small amount of symbology. He uses like the north with the signature of his son, and he only marks, without previous explanation, 2 ports and 2 battles that are important in the next history without he saying anything. These are all the symbols that appear. I'm not sure it's really visible, but the towers, the Shire, some bridges, cities, the Tower for Thank as well. Here we can see the importance he gave to the scale and the narrative, and the importance it had also in the narrative and the distances for the travel. This is in a map. He also has like drawn all the paths that they will follow after. And here, the toponymic layer is perhaps one of the most complex. Every name in Tolkien's map is a linguistic event, as he was a philologist before he was a novelist, and the toponymy of Middle-earth encodes the entire linguistic history of its people. Mordor, Gondor, Lothlorien, the names carry an etymology, cultural memory, political history. Minas Tirith was Minas Anor. The change of name marks a change in the world's condition. The map holds a temporal layer within its surface. Here we can see the psychological layer, the forest. Functions as a third register distinct from both geology and hydrology. Mirkwood, Lothlorien, and Fangorn are not interchangeable forests. Each has a distinct identity, a distinct relationship with the peoples who inhabit its margins, and a distinct narrative function. Lothlorien serves as a refuge. Mirkwood, his symbols hostility. Fangorn is memory. The forests are almost characters in themselves. The map marks their extent but cannot convey their interiority. That incompleteness is kind of a part of the intention that Tolkien had in the map. The geological layer is also important, but here the hydrological layer adds the Anduin, the Great River, the primary axis of communication between north and south, and the fellowship's journey done it by boat is one of the most spatially precise sequences in the narrative. Rivers in Tolkien are never merely geographical. The Brilliant that sweeps away the Nazgul and the ford of Rivendell. The Intwas that drains the forest where the ends move. Water marks the boundaries between territories, between races, between moments of safety and danger. Here, the geological layer, we can see the Misty Mountains divide the map in two, and in doing so, divide the narrative. The entire movement of the Fellowship in the first volume is organized around that range. The failed crossing of Cardras, the descent into Moria, the emergence into Lothlorien. The geography does not illustrate only the history, but actually determines it, as we can already see in the map. Ifilduath encloses Mordor, not only, well, not as decoration, but as a fortification that makes a territory of evil really, really inaccessible, having a natural barrier that doubles as a narrative one. And after all, let me bring these threads together briefly. Well, actually, let me come back to the map for a second. The composition of this map reveals is that it's not only a representation of the Middle Earth, it is a production of it. Each layer contributes a dimension of coherence in the geological, the cultural, historical, linguistic, symbolic, even if if we do not know it from the beginning. That together generates the internal consistency on which Tolkien said secondary belief depends. The map makes the Middle Earth credible, not by showing everything, but by showing the right things at each register. And yet, here at the edges, the coastline trails off. The eastern lands beyond Rune are named, but empty. Mirkwood is marked, but not interior. The Great Havens open onto a sea that has no further shore on the map. These are not failures of the map. These are his decisions, deliberate preservations of the unnamed, and spaces that the map gestures towards, but cannot contain, territories that belong to whoever is reading. That, I think, is the cartographic instrument of the threshold of enchantment. The map is coherent enough to produce secondary belief and incomplete enough to preserve Faërie. Because a world that can be fully mapped ceases to enchant. Now, let me bring now these threads together briefly. We began with a poem, Tolkien arguing that subcreation is a human right, that when we fill the crannies of the world with elves and goblins, we are not lying. We are exercising the same capacity through which we were made. We then asked what that subcreative act looked like from the outside, from the perspective of an architect looking at the built world that subcreation produces. And what we found was a code for rules governing the architecture of Middle-earth, organized around a single axis, the relationship between a civilization and the natural world. That code, when tested against a second universe with no direct relationship to the first, turned out to be only partly shared. There is a common architectural language of modern fantasy, but it operates in Echo's term as a genuine design system. When then asked what produced the territory in which that architecture stands, and the answer is a map that operates on multiple layers simultaneously, geological, cultural, historical, linguistic, symbolic, while as well preserving at its edges and in its silences the reducible incompleteness that makes enchantment possible. The map does not capture Middle-earth, but it generates the possibility of each of us understanding our own Middle Earth. And just for the end, perhaps no one understood the cartography of the threshold better than Lewis Carroll. In Hunting of the Snark, the crew sets sail with a map that is, in his word, he had bought a large map presenting the sea without the least vestige of land, and the crew were much pleased when they found it to be a map they could all understand. What's the good of Mercator's North Poles and equators, tropics, zones, and meridian lines? So the bellman would cry, and the crew would reply, they are merely conventional signs. Other maps are such shapes with their islands and capes. We've got our brave captain to thank, so the crew would protest, that he's bought us the best, a perfect and absolute blank. It is for me the funniest and most precise description of fantastical cartography ever written. The blank map is not a failure, it's an invitation. It's the threshold itself, the space that cannot be drawn because it belongs to whoever crosses it. That is where Middle Earth lives, in the coastline that's trail off, in the forest without roads, in the seas that have no farther shore. The architecture helped us see how the world is organized. The cartography tells us how the world is generated and the space between what the map shows and what it leaves unnamed. That might be, in Tolkien's word, where we as mortal men could exist when we are enchanted. Thank you.